Good afternoon. I think we all know that you can examine clothing for damage and stains as well as for trace evidence, and that is a routine part of our examinations. I was put in a situation where examining the clothing led to observations which I couldn't find in the literature. I looked through all of the literature I could find on cuts and damage to clothing. The forensic examination of fibers, the second edition, the book, chapter 4 deals with stabbing and cutting events and has a very good bibliography for all of the different types of fabric damage that have been reported in the literature. Since that book was published, there's been a few more papers published. Monahan and Harding have published a few papers that have dealt with a little bit of slash type cutting as well as stabbing cutting. And Topin did a paper where she rolled fabric in broken glass to see what would happen. It was a beer bottle type case where she was doing that, a beer bottle stabbing. And she wanted to see what kind of cut you got from rolling the body in the glass. She found that you did get discontinuous cuts, and you got a large number of cuts. And that was supported by the type of work I did. So when we're doing a glass examination, if you looked at the CTS proficiencies, you would think that all that we do is examine the glass to determine its refractive index, its elemental composition, its density. But that isn't all we do, and we know that. The bigger role of us as trace examiners is the other roles, to determine is there glass present. We're in a position where that can be one of the most difficult aspects of the case, is looking for the glass in the first place. If the clothing first goes to another section, that evidence can be lost. If they do the tape lifts on the clothing for you and they say, we collected all the trace, it's on the tape lifts, we know that's not necessarily the case, especially with glass. Tape lifts don't collect it routinely. So that's our first job. The second job is to determine if the location and quantity have any significance. Again, if we don't get clothing packaged in the correct way, if we don't get it, if we're not the first to receive it, that information's lost. So we know that's critical to the glass case. The third part is the part that CTS tests. We do the physical examination. But going further than that, is there any other probative evidence in the glass case that could help the investigators? And that's the part where I was making observations to the clothing I was examining that seemed very important to me. This became especially clear in 1994 when I was presented with a homicide case. Although I'd made these observations in the past, I hadn't done a whole lot with them. But when the homicide occurred, I had a situation in which a woman had been beaten by her boyfriend. He had been imprisoned, but he was let out prematurely. She had expected him to be in prison for some time, and through a mix-up with the courts, he was released early. When she came home from work, she was killed. Fortunately, her daughter was staying with the grandmother at the time and wasn't there to be involved in the homicide. The boyfriend said, of course, that he had gone over to her house, they'd gotten in an argument, the back window to the bedroom had been broken during a fight, but he had left while she was still alive. I was given the window, the entire window, to examine. When the pieces of the window went back together, they showed that the source of the breakage to the window was a screwdriver on the outside edge of the window. You could see the screwdriver tool mark where the point of origin of the break was. You could see that the breakage was from the outside based on the conchoidal lines on the edges of the glass. When I examined his jacket, I was able to find glass particles that corresponded to the window. And furthermore, looking at his jacket, on the right sleeve, there were some cuts that looked like cuts I had observed in burglary cases involving breakage of glass. These cuts didn't look typical of knife cuts to me. They were to the surface yarns, not to the underlying yarns in the weave. They were very, very sharply made cuts where there was cutting, but there were places where the cuts ended and then started up again. So there were also places where the cuts went from being very sharp cuts to being cuts that had pulling associated with them, like a cut tear type phenomenon, as though the blade went from being very, very sharp to being a dull blade, and then skipping over the fabric, becoming a sharp blade, becoming a dull blade, a sort of like change in blade characteristics through the length of a cut. I subsequently had a robbery. I must say, on the homicide, what I did was I did test cuts in the jacket to undamaged areas, and I presented the results of the test cuts in court, in which I explained to the judge and jury that the test cuts for glass were much more similar to cuts from a knife. And that was as far as I went on that case. He was found guilty of the homicide. I subsequently had this robbery, and this was one of those people you feel sorry for, like he was having a really, really bad day. He and his friend were trying to steal from this jewelry store, and one of the employees went and got a gun, and he comes after these two guys with the gun, and they take off through the back of the jewelry store, break out a window in the back of the jewelry store, and the one guy is found about a mile away wearing this pair of, this was like this close weave nylon jogging pant type outfit he was wearing. He has a bullet hole in his leg, and he has all of these cuts to the clothing he's wearing. And again, these cuts are not what I would expect to see from just someone being cut by scissors or knives or any of the other kinds of cuts I'm used to observing when I'm looking at clothing damage. These cuts have some characteristics that strike me as unusual. All of the cuts seem to be made by sharp blades, although there is the occasional tearing. The cuts, I don't know if you've ever tried to cut a piece of fabric out from another piece of fabric, but once you've cut several sides, it's usually hard to take a knife and cut the other side, like the fabric will fold over as opposed to cutting. It needs some tension to be cut with a knife. With scissors, of course, it's fairly easy to cut out a piece of fabric, but it's hard to cut it out with knives. But with the glass, this phenomenon happened fairly easily, is that the glass was like slash, slash all over the place, and you ended up with little bits of cloth coming out. Which is in the upper left photo, you can see the fabric being cut in all directions. Another phenomenon that I started to see with this, and I saw it in the homicide case as well, was that the cuts tended to have cuts where you had more than one cut beside it, and they ran parallel. So you had 2 blades cutting or 3 blades cutting simultaneously in a similar direction. And again, the cuts were doing this skipping across the surface. Another thing I observed in the lining of this pair of jogging pants was something I called bridging yarns. It seemed like where the fabric had been tucked, folded under, the blade was able to cut right across the surface of the fabric while leaving the underlying folded portions of the fabric undamaged. This picture shows the glass that was found in the pocket formed between the lining of the pants and the outer surface of the pants, and in with the glass, a couple of the little pieces of fabric that were cut out. So interesting cutting going on. But again, nothing documented in the literature for me to sort of refer to when I went into court to say that this was cutting made by glass. Once again, when I testified on this case, said that when I made cuts to the fabric, that the glass was the source that gave the most consistent cutting with what I was seeing in the clothing. Subsequently had a hit and run case. The body was found on the side of the road. He had actually been bicycling to the store for some groceries and was hit by a vehicle. I was asked, did he in fact hit the windshield? It was an investigative type thing. Did he hit the windshield? We want to know so that we know to look for that kind of vehicle. And it was pretty obvious pretty quickly that he had glass associated with him. There was actually a large shard of glass located in one of the cuts. The cuts again showed all of the characteristics I'd been seeing with these cuts made in cases involved with broken glass. Numerous cuts, cuts to the surface, parallel cuts, all of the same characteristics. I decided, okay, if no one else is going to do this research, I guess I'm just going to have to do it myself. So we got a student working for us for the summer. She rigged up a frame where a piece of glass could be clamped between the two pieces of wood so that we could break a new piece of glass for each item of clothing. And we went to a secondhand store. And what we tried to do is get a cross-section of clothing types. We wanted to look at knits and weaves. We also got one leather jacket. We wanted to look at synthetic fabrics and also at natural fabrics. So we had actually the denim jacket, which is something I saw quite often in my casework and wanted to see how it responded to broken glass. A jogging type jacket, a knit jacket, a knit sweatshirt, and a woven shirt. This shows a glass blade under magnification, and it I think paints quite a story about what's happening to the glass when it's doing its cutting. You might think that the whole edge of the glass is going to be doing the cutting, but it turned out that when this glass was doing the cutting, it was really just the very, very fine tip of the glass right here that disappeared as the cut was being made, which helps explain why these cuts are so sharp, is because we are dealing with very thin blades, very, very fine blades, razor sharp. And the other thing that this explained to me was why I was seeing the sort of tearing phenomenon as well as the cutting phenomenon. These blades are so incredibly small, it makes sense that they are actually breaking off and dulling down as the cutting's going on. So that what I was seeing was going from a sharp blade to a dull blade. And when you cut clothing with a dull knife, you see some of that tearing. So I'm going from cutting with a sharp blade to cutting with a dull blade. Or from a thin blade to a thick blade. This represents some of the phenomenon that I observed when I did my examinations of this clothing after each article of clothing was pushed through the broken glass window. And the clothing was purposely pushed through the window to make as much contact as possible with the glass. In fact, the other day when we saw the person reaching through the broken glass to open the door, you know, I was thinking about what wonderful cuts were being formed on the sleeve of the jacket. So sharp cuts, that's a clue. If you have cuts that are really, really sharp, look like they were made with a razor sharp blade, that's pretty much got to be present. Otherwise, I would question whether glass had done this, because glass definitely has these razor sharp blades. In fact, Margaret Barber was talking about having done some experiments with a broken beer bottle and actually being amazed at how sharp the edges of the bottle are. The other thing that I found was very, very common was to get these cuts that I've listed here as multiple cuts in line, where you have the cutting, no cutting, cutting, no cutting, cutting, no cutting going on. I'm assuming this is caused either by the blade breaking or by ripples in the fabric as the blade passes across it. It could be either, it could be both. The leather jacket was definitely the source that showed the best evidence of this parallel cutting. The parallel cutting is because you have multiple blades. Around the opening to that broken window, you have broken blades all the way around the window. So each of those blades can cause a cut. And because the arm's going through in one direction, those cuts will go through in a parallel direction. Of course, if the arm was to change direction, your cuts would be expected to change direction. The cuts could be very shallow. I'm assuming, again, that this is because you have these blades are actually very, very narrow blades that are formed on the glass. And you could see very frequently yarns that bridged across the cut. Now, in these subsequent pictures, the photographs do not show all of the types of cuts that I observed in the particular clothing. So I've got listed here all of the types of cuts that were observed in various locations on the clothing as it was passed through the glass. The blue jean jacket showed very sharp cuts, multiple cuts in line, parallel cuts, and shallow cuts. The knit dress jacket showed sharp cuts, multiple cuts in line, shallow cuts, and bridging fibers. The nylon jogging jacket showed sharp cuts, multiple cuts in line, shallow cuts, and bridging fibers. The nylon jogging jacket showed sharp cuts, multiple cuts in line, shallow cuts with bridging fibers. And the woven shirt showed sharp cuts, multiple cuts in line, parallel cuts, and shallow cuts. The leather jacket showed sharp cuts, multiple cuts in line, parallel cuts, shallow cuts with bridging fibers, and one additional feature. This was, it was not something I had planned on happening, but when it happened, it's kind of obvious that your piece of glass can gouge out a little piece of leather and leave these small leather tags. And I've since seen these, and they're very easily used for saying that the cut is a recent cut, because these tags are not going to last on this clothing very long. They are held on literally by a thread. The knit shirt showed sharp cuts, multiple cuts in line, and shallow cuts with bridging fibers. And the sweatshirt, sharp cuts, multiple cuts in line, and shallow cuts. One thing that occurs quite frequently in the clothing associated with these glass broken window entries and whatnot is also tearing, where the clothing catches on a piece of glass that does not have a sharp blade and it just tears. So to see tearing mixed in with the cutting is not unusual. And my conclusion after doing the study was that the blade characteristics that are demonstrated by the damage observed in the clothing are that you have sharp blades. The blades are very shallow in depth, and you have multiple blades. When I testify now in court, I give this information to the courts. I say that the cuts do not have to be made by glass, but they do have to be made by blades with these characteristics, and I'm unaware of another source with these characteristics. So the question we're left with is how probative are glass cuts? This was a car prowl suspect's jacket. I had more pictures than these two, but I thought these two were fairly representative of the cuts observed in his jacket. This was a case which I know none of you have ever had to deal with, where the detectives had not collected any control glass and just wanted to know if there was glass on the jacket. I can see some smiles in here. Have you been faced with that? Okay. Was there glass on the jacket was the question. Yes, there was glass on the jacket. Of course, that's not incredibly probative. However, I felt like the presence of the glass with the glass cuts, even without comparison glass, did have significance because he's got to explain away not just where the glass came from at this point, but he's got to explain away why the front of his jacket is covered with glass cuts. Thank you.